Okay, ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen guten Abend und möchte Ihnen jetzt als ersten Redner den Vizepräsidenten Professor Schleiff der Universität Frankfurt ankündigen.
So I would like to thank you for the enthusiasm about myself. Dear Professor Davis, dear Professor Wischermann, dear colleagues, and dear guests, it's an exceptional honor, and you have actually welcomed Angela Davis more than I can do. But I would like to welcome you also from the executive committee from the Goethe-Universität here in Frankfurt. The Cornelia Goethe Center for Women's and Gender Studies established the Angela Davis Visiting Professorship for International Gender and Diversity Studies and managed to attract yourself, Angela, as a first candidate. So it's a double name professorship. It's Angela Davis on Angela Davis Visiting Professorship. From my point of view, this is an utmost appropriate constellation that for sure you rarely come across anywhere else. I would like to congratulate you, Professor Wischermann, on behalf of your own and your colleagues on this really amazing success. It is an integral part of the Goethe-University's mission to render equality in academia a guiding principle of decisions in all fields of actions, and I, as the Vice President, stand up for this principle. And we have been successful in many sectors, not at last due to the efforts of the Cornelia Goethe Center and its members. But more of this later. First of all, it is particularly important to me to remind us of the special connection between Ms. Davis to Frankfurt, and more specifically to the Goethe-University. I think everybody knows that Professor Davis was and is a pioneer in the worldwide struggle for equality, liberty, and democracy. She links this political commitment to scientific work on a scale which is rather unusual in our days, but which was more common in the 60s and 70s with prevailing climate of awakening and action against inherited stereotypes, discrimination, and marginalization. We all witnessed many change due to the better in many countries of the world, concerning gender equality, racial equality, and improvement of the situation for handicapped people, to name a few sectors. Nevertheless, in many cases, we stopped in the middle of the development. In my personal opinion, this is a shame. It was by no means accidental that Angela Davis studied at our university between 65 and 67. She had met Herbert Marcuse, her later supervisor at Brandeis University, and he suggested her to go to Frankfurt, where she was working on Hegel and the existentialists in the environment of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas. And today we can proudly say the Frankfurt School definitely mattered for your, Professor Davis, academic, but also political engagement. It was a crucial phase of the German student revolts, and you have been active in the student movement, though the challenges in West Germany were obviously different from those in the United States. Besides, it is not only the western part of Germany which is important for your biography, dear Professor Davis. At the beginning of the 70s in the GDR, where I personally come from, there was, like in many countries of the world, an enormous wave of solidarity with you, who was imprisoned at this time. The Freie Deutsche Jugend launched a campaign called 1 Million Roses for Angela Davis, 1 Million Rosen für Angela Davis. This campaign consisted in sending postcards to the prison, and I'm sure at the end it had been 1 million, at least. In January 1972, the state-leading party of the GDR even gathered about 2,000 people in the Congress Hall near the Berliner Alexanderplatz with the slogan, "Free Angela Davis." In the same year, West Germany awakened as well. Please, dear colleagues, forgive me, this may be somewhat biased formulation. Here at Goethe-University, a Congress of Solidarity was held, and Herbert Marcuse publicly denounced the political repression against Angela Davis as a woman, as a black person, and as a communist. Later on, Ms. Davis got committed for the rights of political prisoners on the basis of her own experience. I already mentioned that we, and this holds particularly true for German universities, have still a lot of work to do for the benefit of equality and combating stereotypes. At the same time, we owe it to people like Angela Davis that we are where we are in these days. In the contrast to some decades ago, it is now firmly anchored in the minds that we have to take our responsibility as individuals as well as institutions and must interfere where necessary. The universities, and among them the Goethe-University, have been meeting this challenge since several years now and took active steps in giving its members equal opportunities. We are providing, on the one hand, an array of programs of career support for women in academia. Let me, for example, mention the program Professur, preparing highly qualified female scientists of all disciplines for leadership positions in academia. This program is being supported by 5 universities in the state of Hessen as a common goal. Young female researchers in the sciences are promoted by the group mentoring program Cimento, which supports them on their track to professorship or other science-related leadership positions. Besides those programs, it is especially gender and diversity research and teaching that make an indispensable contribution to the realization of equality. In addition, just these days, the Executive Committee of the Goethe-University has passed a policy paper concerning measures to improve equality at the Goethe-University for the next years. Cornelia Goethe Center is a facility at our university where interdisciplinary gender studies are carried out with huge success. The center will gain further profile and international visibility with its Angela Davis visiting professorship. And that you, Professor Davis, are the first visiting professor is an extreme honor and can without any doubt be considered as a guarantee for a success of this professorship. Before I want to give the floor to Professor Wischermann again, it only reminds me for me to wish you, Professor Davis, a highly interesting and productive time here in Frankfurt as you had roughly 25 years ago. I thought with great pleasure that you are going to have a block seminar together with our student, what will for sure be of great benefit for both sides. Finally, I would like to wish us all a successful and inspiring kickoff event with Ms. Davis' lecture tonight. Thank you very much, and have fun.
Dear colleagues, dear audience, as the Managing Director of the Cornelia Goethe Center for Women and Gender Studies, I am very happy to welcome you here tonight. I am, as you are, very eager to hear Angela Davis speak this evening about feminism and abolition, theories and practices for the 21st century. With this inauguration lecture, she opens the new Visitor Professorship for International Gender and Diversity Studies, which is named after her, and she is also the first international renowned scientist who is going to hold it. Let me first say something about the circumstances of this professorship and what it is aiming at. The Angela Davis Visitor Professorship for International Gender and Diversity Studies is initiated by the Cornelia Goethe Center, CGC. The center was founded in 1997 as a central interdisciplinary scientific department of the Goethe-Universität, Frankfurt. The CGC bases its analytical work on an epistemological and theoretical critique of gender, maintaining its relevance as a historical, social, and cultural construction. The scientific work of the Cornelia Goethe Center shows how much a society that is getting more and more complex is in need of answers from a gender research with an interdisciplinary as well as an intersectional perspective. At the CGC, we have a long history of research and teaching work that focuses not only on gender, but on its correlation with other axes of difference. When we first thought about something like a visitor professorship, we had all this in mind. What we wanted and want is to make a point, to inspire, to initiate debates, and maybe controversies. But last but not least, we wanted to include a specific thought of critique, the kind of elaborated critique that the Frankfurter Schule or kritische Theorie stands for. This is not only because of a geographical coincidence. Even more so, the reason for initiating this visitor professorship is the deep need for social critique in a time where we have to deal with a complex and multi-layered global economic crisis that leads to new social conflicts and new barriers and new forms of social exclusion. An economic crisis that implies a renewed critique towards capitalism and the kind of democratic participation that is offers to us. With Angela Davis, we have chosen someone who is connected to the Frankfurter Schule. She studied, it has already been mentioned, with Herbert Marcuse at the University of California, and between 1965 and 1967, she studied in Frankfurt with other theorists of the Frankfurter Schule, namely with Adorno, Horkheimer, Habermas, and Negt. Angela Davis has fought against political and social oppression. She fought for civil rights. She fought for social justice and was one of the pivotal intellectuals to introduce the perspective of multifaceted oppression, the triple oppression of gender, race, and class. This approach has been an integral part of her research and her political engagement when the term intersectionality was still unknown. Angela Davis' scientific career is one of the kind that nowadays hardly ever will happen. She grew up as a person of color in an openly racist society. She was part of the Communist Party in a country that was deeply afraid of anything even close to communism. She was in prison and as a prisoner became famous. All over the world, also at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt, there have been campaigns that showed their solidarity with Angela Davis. Under the pressure of these worldwide campaigns, she was released from prison, and in summer 1972, she has been acquitted by the court. In 1975, Angela Davis went along with her university career that was intermittent because of an employment ban. From 1991 until 2008, she held a professorship of African American and Feminist Studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. We are delighted to have her here tonight and for the next 2 weeks. I'm sure that with her lectures and seminars, she will inspire our students of the Gender Studies program, the members of the CGC and the university, and last but not least, also the local public. To establish this Angela Davis Professorship for International Gender and Diversity that will be held by international renowned scientists, it was necessary to get support from other institutions. Therefore, I would like to thank the Frankfurt Research Center for Postcolonial Studies, the Friends of the CGC, Freuderkreis des Cornelia Goethe-Zentrums, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Hessen, the Frauenreferat der Stadt Frankfurt, and last but not least, because they sponsored this evening especially, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Hessen. I'm very happy that all of you made this evening and the professorship possible. And now I give the word to Professor Nikita Dhawan, who will introduce the lecture. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As already mentioned, my name is Nikita Dhawan, and I'm Junior Professor for Political Science with designated emphasis on Gender and Postcolonial Studies, and Director of the Frankfurt Research Center for Postcolonial Studies in the context of the Cluster of Excellence, the formation of normative orders here at the Goethe-Universität, Frankfurt, and also part of the CGC Direktorin. It's a great pleasure for me to here introduce Professor Angela Davis. One of the biggest challenges for those of us who seek to transform unjust social, political, and economic relations is to undo the discontinuity between theory production and critical practice. Invariably, we tend to prioritize one at the cost of the other, with the risk of either producing theory that is detached and depoliticized with little relevance to the everyday lives of the disenfranchised and dispossessed, of reifying experience where self-reflection and self-critique are sacrificed in the urgency of acting here and now. It is a great pleasure and honor on behalf of my colleague, Professor Helma Lutz, who's Professor of Sociology, to introduce one of today's greatest thinker, author, activist, and scholar of our time, Professor Dr. Angela Davis, who's an inspiring example that it is indeed possible to reconcile high theory with radical politics. Born in Birmingham, Alabama during the time of segregation, her experiences with racism were formative in her political and intellectual endeavors. Dr. Davis is Distinguished Professor Emerita of the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and former director of the university's Feminist Studies Department. As an undergraduate student at Brandeis, where she was one of the 3 black students in her freshman class, and this has been mentioned repeatedly, Angela Davis first encountered the Frankfurt School philosopher Herbert Marcuse. In a television interview, she said, and I quote her, "Herbert Marcuse taught me that it was indeed possible to be an academic, an activist, a scholar, and a revolutionary," end of quote. As a major in French, she went to Paris to study at the Sorbonne. Upon completion of her bachelor's degree, she came to Germany in 1965 to study philosophy. As student at the University of Frankfurt, she had a stipend of $100 a month to cover her living costs. In her autobiography, Angela Davis mentions that when at the end of the month approached, she was eating nothing but quark. So we made sure we won't be serving any quark at the reception today. After 2 years in Frankfurt, she returned to the US to get her master's degree from the University of California, San Diego, where Marcuse was teaching. She later did her PhD in philosophy from the Humboldt University in East Berlin. As is well known, she was leader of the Communist Party USA and was closely affiliated with the Black Panther Party through her involvement in the civil rights movement. She was twice a candidate for vice president on the Communist Party USA ticket during the 1980s. Her membership in the Communist Party led to Ronald Reagan's efforts to have her barred from teaching at any university in the state of California. She was fired from UCLA in 1969 and in 1970 was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, after which she went underground. During the 2 months that Davis was a fugitive, hundreds, if not thousands of other women were incorrectly identified by law enforcement officials, and many were arrested as Angela Davis. Her case culminated in one of the most famous trials in the recent history and led to a worldwide campaign to free Angela Davis. She was, as has again already been mentioned, has already been mentioned, was acquitted of all charges in 1972, the year I was born. Her writings on feminism, critical race theory, Marxism, slavery, and philosophy and history of punishment and prisons are canonical and a must-read for any class on critical theory. Amongst her numerous publications are If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, Angela Davis, An Autobiography, Joanne Little, The Dialectics of Rape, Women, Race and Class, Blues, Legacies and Black Feminism, Women, Culture, Politics, Are Prisons Obsolete, Abolition Democracy, and most recently, The Meaning of Freedom. Angela Davis is without a doubt one of the most eminent public intellectuals. Her academic and activist work has inspired all of us and has been important for our intellectual formation, motivating us to struggle for social change. She is a living witness that change is indeed possible. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Angela Davis to Goethe-Universität Frankfurt.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. First of all, let me tell you what a great honor it is to be here this evening, to have been invited to speak to you on the occasion of the inauguration of a new visiting professorship in Women and Gender Studies, about which you have heard a great deal from the last speakers. But I'll say the name because it sounds strange to me. The Angela Davis Visiting Professorship in International Gender and Diversity Studies. I thank everyone who's been involved in this project. Professor Helma Lutz for having contacted me initially, and the director of the program, Professor Ulla Wischermann, and of course I thank Nikita Dhawan for the wonderful introduction. I should also acknowledge Maria Teresa Herrera for her very important work on this project. And she was the first person I saw when I got off the plane yesterday. I can't believe it was just yesterday that I arrived. This is actually my first full day in Frankfurt. My first response to this idea of a visiting professorship was to travel backwards along the trajectory of my own history and try to imagine what it could have been like to foresee such a development when I was a student here in Frankfurt, not 25 years ago, but almost twice that time, approximately a half century ago. And I'm not referring to the fact that the visiting professorship bears my name, because that would have been entirely beyond the horizon of my imagination. But rather I refer to the conjunction of the words international, gender, and diversity. At the time, I think I would have associated international with internationalism or international solidarity. I would have thought about Cuba, Vietnam. As a matter of fact, my first major activism against the war in Vietnam happened here in Frankfurt. And of course, a few years after I returned to the US, it turned out that I was the beneficiary of a phenomenal international solidarity movement. Were it not for that movement, I would probably not be standing before you this evening. At that time, not only had the term gender not acquired the currency it has today, but what we know as the women's movement was just beginning to emerge. Aside from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and perhaps Engels' Origin of the Family and maybe Clara Zetkin's work, we had not yet accumulated the literature, the texts, and the vocabularies that have enabled discourses, radical discourses on women's position in society. Moreover, the term diversity had no political or academic valence. In other words, a program on gender and diversity would have been utterly perplexing at that time. But this reverse trajectory reminds me how important it is for academics and activists alike to maintain a stance of self-reflexivity, to seriously examine not only the object of one's study or the object of one's organizing, but also to examine the conceptual and methodological approaches one is taking as one engages in scholarship or activism. In other words, we must try not to allow concepts to achieve the status of being taken for granted, not even those concepts that appear to be most obvious to us, like gender, perhaps, or diversity. This is a lesson that has remained with me since the 2 years I spent here at the Goethe-Universität, when I had the opportunity, as you've heard many times, also to study with Adorno and Horkheimer, Habermas, Oskar Negt. Focus not simply on the object, but always on the conceptual tools one uses to understand the object. And this is, of course, even more important for interdisciplinary studies. Or rather, one might say that interdisciplinarity requires a greater vigilance with respect to foundational concepts and methods that otherwise are so easily taken for granted. And that is one of the real values of interdisciplinarity. So, what is gender? What is diversity? What do we think we know about gender and diversity that allows us to deploy these concepts as starting points for further study? And how do we frame what we do not know so that we do not foreclose what might turn out to be the most exciting questions in the field? During the latter 20th century in the US and within international scholarly and policy settings, there were numerous debates on how to define the category woman. These struggles were over who got included and who was excluded from the category. And I think these struggles are key to understanding why there was resistance from women of color within the US, from many women in what we then call the Third World, and indeed also from poor and working class white women to identify with what was an emergent feminist movement. As a matter of fact, as I pointed out earlier today, when I wrote the book Women, Race, and Class, and people began to refer to me as a feminist, and I said, feminist? I'm not a feminist. I'm a black woman revolutionary. And at that point, it seemed to me that those two terms were irreconcilable. But many of us viewed the struggle for women's rights as ideologically saturated with unacknowledged race and class issues. In other words, as a struggle that purported to speak for all women, while actually addressing issues of white middle-class women's rights, it rendered invisible working class and poor women. It erased Black women, Latinas, other women of color. It erased African women, Asian women, Latin American women from the whole discursive field that was supposed to be covered by the category woman. And so these many contestations over that category helped to produce what was at one point called radical women of color feminist theories and practices. And I think it's important to point out that at the same time that questions about the universality of the category woman were being raised, similar concerns about the category human were being debated, especially in relation to the underlying individualism of human rights discourses. How could that category be rethought not only to embrace Africans, indigenous people, and other non-Europeans, but how might it apply to groups and communities, and not primarily to individuals? Late 20th century Western versions of feminism that did not explicitly address racism and imperialism and colonialism were hotly contested during the 1975 International Women's Conference in Mexico City. And some of you may be familiar with that conference. It was 1975 was the year of the woman. And then the United Nations recognized that a year was much too short to address all of these issues. And so it proclaimed the decade of the woman. And it was 10 years later, at the conclusion of that decade, that an international conference on women took place in Nairobi, Kenya. It was at that conference that a feminism that contested the prioritization of gender at the expense of race, class, and nation began to take shape. Many of us who were in attendance at the NGO gathering became familiar with the work of Afro-German cultural worker Fazia Janssen, whose life is discussed in Tina Kamp's book, Other Germans, Black Germans, and the Politics of Race, Gender, and Memory in the Third Reich. The work of women like Fazia Janssen made it possible for a younger generation to cluster around Audre Lorde and produce the pioneering work Farbe bekennen, afrodeutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte. And this is a work that has become a classic alongside This Bridge Called My Back in the US and Charting the Journey in the UK. The Nairobi conference took place in the midst of a period of passionate contestation over the exclusivity, over the perceived exclusivity of the women's movement. This was the first time that such a vast gathering had taken place on the continent of Africa. And it was also the first time where there was such a large delegation of women of color from the US at an international gathering. And as I look back, I realize that the prevailing assumption at that time was that our work around the category woman was perceived to be one of expansion. We thought that our primary responsibility was to expand the category woman in order to make room for those women who had been excluded. This was a project against racism. It was a project against nationalism. But we naively thought that we had effectively addressed the problem of the exclusivity of the category by simply making more space, making room. And I think there are people today who still assume that it is only a question of making room. What we did not recognize at that time was that we had to rethink the whole category rather than simply assimilate more women into an unchanged notion of what counts as woman. The importance of thoroughly rethinking this category gradually became clearer as we made deeper explorations into one of the earliest issues taken up by women's movements, and not only in the US and Europe, but also in Africa, Asia, Latin America. This was the issue of violence against women, gender violence. Challenging the pandemic of gender violence emerged as one of the struggles that opened new organizing possibilities as well as new epistemological horizons. In this context, I want to refer to the work of scholar activist Beth Ritchie, whose most recent book is Arrested Justice: Black Women, Violence, and the Prison Nation. In her critique of the mainstream anti-violence movement, Ritchie refers to the every woman paradox, which in many ways recapitulates those earliest struggles over the category woman. Research, she writes, began to assess the extent of violence toward every woman as opposed to all women, as a way to convince people in power of the importance of the issue. And she goes on to say the slogan was, it could happen to anyone. It could happen to anyone. In fact, she writes, the assumed race and class neutrality of gender violence, to some extent ignoring the issue of sexuality, led to the erasure from the dominant view of the victimization of lesbians, women of color in low-income communities, and other marginalized groups. State violence and harmful public policies could not fit into the every woman analytical paradigm of the male violence that focused on individual men. The loss of focus on these groups seriously compromised the transgressive and transformative potential of the anti-violence movement's racial and social critique of power, various patriarchies, economic exploitation, and heterosexism. Anyone, she points out, came to mean the women with the most visibility, the most power, and the most public sympathy. The citizens whose experience of violence is taken most seriously. So the image, she writes, of the every woman becomes a white, middle-class woman who can turn to a counselor, a doctor, a police officer, or a lawyer to protect her from abuse. And finally, she points out that it is largely still the case that community problems are cast in racially specific but gender-neutral macro terms. And mainstream anti-violence work is based on a gender-specific but racially neutral micro-analysis of individual harm. And as a result, the women who are most vulnerable to violence are the ones who remain unprotected. While Here, Beth Ritchie is specifically referring to the experience of the anti-violence movement in the US. There are implications to be drawn for the process of challenging racism in Europe, and specifically the coloniality that is being challenged by activist groups here in Germany. Ritchie's overarching argument is that the reliance on criminalization led the feminist anti-violence movement to collaborate with law enforcement, thus reproducing and advancing the already existing pattern of racialized criminalization. In the following section of my talk, I want to refer to the work of two organizations in the US, in the hope that there are lessons to be learned from on-the-ground feminist activism in the US today, just as this US activism has much to learn from the experiences and analyses of formations like the Black Initiative in Germany, for example. But I also want to take seriously the need to demystify the US as the primary site of racism, and to be conscious of my own positionality. And I quote from Gayatri Spivak, and particularly from her essay on feminism and critical theory. She writes, in the matter of race-sensitive analyses, the chief problem of American feminist criticism is its identification of racism as such with the constitution of racism in America. Thus, today I see the object of investigation to be not only the history of third world women or their testimony, but also the production through the great European theories, often by way of literature, of the great colonial object. As long as American feminists understand history as positivistic empiricism that scorns theory and therefore remains ignorant of its own, the third world as our object of study will remain constituted by those hegemonic first world intellectual practices. So it is with this caution that I want to go on to consider two organizations that attempt to transform the meaning of anti-racism and feminism. The first organization is called INCITE, I-N-C-I-T-E, with an exclamation point. But it might also be called INSIGHT, I-N-S-I-G-H-T, with an exclamation point. INCITE, Women of Color Against Violence. It is a network of radical feminists of color working to end violence against women, against gender nonconforming and trans people of color, and larger communities. It employs direct action, critical dialogue, and grassroots organizing. In the aftermath of the first conference organized by the abolitionist organization, of which I'm a co-founder, Critical Resistance, in 1998, INCITE produced a statement on gender violence and the prison industrial complex that included the following passage. Law enforcement approaches to violence against women may deter some acts of violence in the short term. However, as an overall strategy for ending violence, criminalization has not worked. In fact, mandatory arrest laws for domestic violence have led to decreases in the number of battered women who kill their partners in self-defense, but they have not led to a decrease in the number of batterers who kill their partners. And they point out that the law effectively protects batterers more than it protects survivors. Insight is an organization that is at once, as I pointed out, a grassroots feminist organization, and it is also a space for the development of new feminist epistemologies by activist intellectuals, both inside and outside of the academy. It is an organization that challenges gender violence in its manifold contexts, emphasizing the links between intimate violence, institutional violence, between structural violence and epistemic violence. Such a framework requires integrated analyses of race, class, gender, nation, sexuality, ability, etc. Such an approach made it possible to understand that what had originally emerged as a major argument against the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, namely that abolitionist strategies would prevent the most widespread mode of violence in the world, violence against women, from being effectively addressed. And of course, this had to do with timing. Precisely at the moment when gender violence began to be recognized as a political question, the issue of abolition was being introduced as a way of extricating ourselves from the century-old strategy of prison reform, which has primarily served to strengthen the institution of the prison and its ideological fortifications. But there were those who asked, why do you want to abolish imprisonment when we have just now acquired the capacity to punish purveyors of gender violence? But if this critique had had any real meaning, and I'm not underestimating the place from which that critique stemmed, but given the number of people who are in jail and prison, mostly men, but also some women, who have been arrested throughout the world on charges of sexual assault, spousal battery, and other modes of gender violence, one would assume that by now the incidence of gender violence would have decreased. But of course, this is not the case. Given all of the agencies and in the amazing grassroots activism that has happened over the last 30, 35 years, one would assume that we should be able now to claim that there is less gender violence on the planet. But this is not the case. As a matter of fact, it is possible to argue that in the era of mass incarceration, and I'm speaking of a development in the US, which is increasingly being recognized as a characteristic of the era of global capitalism throughout the world, one might argue that mass incarceration not only reproduces gender violence, but it further complicates that violence it further complicates gender violence with the violence that is the very hub of the operation of imprisonment. I would also like to refer to another organization that is like Insight, feminist and abolitionist. It is an organization that is, it has a national reach within the US, but it is a local organization based in the city where I live, Oakland, California. The name of that organization is the Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project, TGIP. And it advocates and defends and includes primarily trans women of color. So these are women who also have to fight to be included within the category woman in a way that is not dissimilar from the earlier struggles of black women and women of color who were assigned the gender female at birth. Their work is deeply feminist because they work at the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality. They address the individual predicaments of members of their community, and they address structural issues while they advocate for prison abolition. Trans women of color constitute the population that is most harassed by police, most arrested, most incarcerated. And they primarily end up in male prisons, even, and especially if they have not undergone gender reassignment surgery, and sometimes even if they have. After they are in prison, they often receive more violent treatment by the guards. And on top of that, they are marked by the institution as the targets of prisoner violence on which the institution depends for its very operation. Beyond the violence to which they are subjected by police, prisons, and prisoners, trans women are often denied hormonal treatments, even if they have valid prescriptions. We have a great deal to learn about the reach of the prison system, about the nature of the prison industrial complex, about the reach of abolition by examining the particular struggles of trans prisoners, and especially trans women. But perhaps most important, and this is central to the development of feminist abolitionist theories and practices, we learn how to think and act and struggle against what is ideologically constituted as normal. Prisons are, of course, ideologically constituted as normal. It takes a lot of work to persuade people to think beyond the bars, to imagine a world without prisons, and to struggle for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment. But one might also ask the question, why are trans women, and especially black trans women who cannot easily pass, considered so far outside the norm? Gender, as we've learned over the last decades, especially in the aftermath of Judith Butler's gender struggle, and also from the work of scholars like Beth Ritchie, we've learned that gender is fundamentally performative. As a matter of fact, Beth Ritchie includes in her recent book an account of the case of the New Jersey Four young black lesbians who ended up in prison because they defended themselves from male violence and then saw themselves represented in the media as a lesbian wolf pack. And so gender and sexual nonconformity lead to racist bestialization, which is an attack not only against the humans, but also against the animals who serve as metaphorical purveyors of violence. Both feminism and abolition, and especially the conjunction of the two, urge us to be flexible, not to become too attached to our objects, whether we're talking about our objects of study or the objects of our organizing, for those objects might become something entirely different as a result of our work. The TGIP, Transgender Gender Variant Intersex Justice Project, shows us not primarily that we need to assimilate trans women into an existing category that remains the same, but that we have to make the category more capacious so that it does not simply reflect normative ideas of who counts as women and who doesn't. So the lesson is, don't become too attached to our objects. Abolitionists must beware of developing an attachment to the prison, especially abolitionist academics. What does it mean to constitute a field of study? Something like critical prison studies, which is an emergent field, interdisciplinary field in the US, and have one's object subject to abolition. And one would assume that the field itself would also eventually be subject to abolition. So how does one identify into a field that one wants to eliminate? And for academics, that's very difficult. The more closely we examine the concept of gender, don't even become too attached to the concept of gender, because the more closely we examine it, the more we discover that it is embedded in a range of social, political, cultural, ideological formations. It is not one thing, and there is not one definition. And certainly now, gender cannot now be adequately described as a binary structure. Therefore, bringing trans women, trans men, intersex, and many forms of gender non-conformity into the concept of gender radically undermines its assumptions. I see I'm taking a little bit more time than I should, so I'm going to skip over some sections. No, it's okay? Is that all right? Okay. All right, well, if you allow me, I wanted to share a quote from the young scholar activist Dean Spade, who writes, "From my understanding, a central endeavor of feminists, queer, and trans activists has been to dismantle the cultural ideology, social practices, and legal norms that say that certain body parts determine gender identity and gendered social characteristics and roles. We have opposed medical and scientific assertions that affirm the purported health of traditional gender roles and activities, and that pathologize bodies that defy those norms. We continue to work to dispel myths that body parts somehow make us who we are and make us less than or better than, depending on which we might have." This process of looking at the convergence of feminism and abolitionism produces insights about both feminism and abolitionism. We learn that an analysis or a struggle is feminist, not necessarily because they address what we perceive to be feminist objects, although racism, the prison industrial complex, criminalization, captivity, violence, and the law are all objects that feminism should analyze and criticize and resist through struggle. But the meaning of feminism that I'm suggesting goes beyond the object and it is a methodological meaning. Feminist methodologies can assist us in major ways. As researchers, as academics, as radical activists, we discover that what appears to be one relatively small and marginal aspect of the category, or what is struggling to enter the category so that it can basically dismantle it from within, can illuminate far more than simply looking at the normative dimensions of the category. Academics are often trained to fear the unexpected. But also activists always want to have a clear idea of our trajectories and our goals. And in both instances, we want to have control so much that oftentimes our scholarly and activist projects are formulated just so that they reconfirm what we think we already know. And that is not interesting at all. It is quite boring. So the question is how to allow for surprises and how to make those surprises productive. I want to emphasize, therefore, the importance of approaching both our theoretical explorations and our movement activism in ways that enlarge and expand and complicate and deepen our theories and practices of freedom. Abolition involves much more than the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, just as the abolition of slavery should have involved a great deal more than simply the abolition of slavery. It involves the reconfiguration of the social, political, and economic conditions that render the prison such a necessary institution. And above all, it involves a serious critique of global capitalism, of neoliberalism, of racism. It involves a process of decolonizing, and it involves the creation of new institutions, new ways of thinking, new ways of being in the world. Likewise, feminism involves so much more than gender equality, so much more than gender. It involves a consciousness of capitalism and racism and colonialism and postcolonialities and ability and more genders than we could possibly imagine and more sexualities than we thought we could name. Feminism has helped us not only to recognize a range of connections among discourses and institutions and identities and ideologies that we tend to consider separately, but it has also helped us to develop epistemological and organizing strategies that take us beyond the categories women and gender. Feminist methods, both in research and in organizing for social justice, require us to challenge the singularity, the separateness, as well as the wholeness of a range of social categories. There is the assumption that because transgender and gender nonconforming populations are relatively small within a prison system that in the US consists of almost 2.5 million people, and I'm referring to jails, prisons, juvenile facilities, I'm referring to immigrant detention centers, military detention centers and prisons, and also what are called jails in Indian country. There are more than 8 million people in jails and prisons throughout the world, and I'll say parenthetically that the US leads every other country in the world. The US has 25% of the incarcerated population of the planet, whereas the population at large constitutes 5%. So there's the assumption that this small group of people deserve less attention because they constitute such a minority. Feminist approaches to the understanding of prisons, and indeed the prison industrial complex, have always insisted that if we look at imprisoned women, who are also a very small percentage throughout the world, we not only learn about the experiences and the regimes surrounding women in prison, but we learn about aspects of the system as a whole that otherwise would not have been accessible to us. Thus also, a feminist approach would insist both on what we can learn and transform with respect to transgender nonconforming prisoners, but also on what this knowledge and what this activism tells us about punishment writ large, about the very apparatus of the prison. If it is true that we cannot begin to think about the abolition of prisons outside of an anti-racist context, it is also true that the abolition of gender policing is an important dimension of anti-prison abolition. This very process reveals the epistemic violence that is inherent in the gender binary in the larger society, and of course it reveals its ideological character. Bringing feminism within an abolitionist frame, and vice versa, bringing abolition within a feminist frame, means that we take seriously the old feminist adage that the personal is that the personal is political. There is a deep relationality that links struggles against institutions and struggles to reinvent our personal lives and to recraft ourselves. We know, for example, that we replicate the structures of retributive punishment in our own emotional responses. Someone attacks us verbally or otherwise, and our response is a counterattack. The retributive impulses of the state reproduce themselves in and through the personal. This is a feminist insight. This is a Marxist-inflected feminist insight. This is perhaps a Marxist-inflected feminist insight that reveals the influence of Foucault regarding the reproductions of relations that enable something like the prison industrial complex. We recognize that the 2.5 million people in prison in the US does not even include those who are incarcerated in psychiatric institutions. And of course, there is a gender differential there. Nor do we often acknowledge the intersection of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. The legal scholar, activist Michelle Alexander points out that mass incarceration inside the US constitutes what she calls the new Jim Crow. But it is also much more. As the linchpin of the prison industrial complex, racialized mass incarceration represents the increasing profitability of punishment. It represents an increasingly global strategy of managing bodies of color and immigrant bodies, and bodies perceived as immigrants no matter how many generations they have lived in Europe or in Germany. I should be more specific. The prison industrial complex produces these bodies as surplus bodies, as disposable populations. Put them in a vast garbage bin. Add sophisticated electronic technology to control them and let them languish there. In the meantime, create the ideological illusion that the surrounding society is safer and more free because the dangerous Black people are locked up. In the meantime, corporations profit and poor communities suffer. Public education suffers because it is not profitable. Public health care suffers. If punishment can be profitable, then certainly health care should be profitable as well. It should also be pointed out that countries like Israel use the carceral technologies developed by the prison industrial complex not only to control the thousands of Palestinian prisoners behind bars, but also to control the everyday lives of Palestinians who live on the West Bank, in Gaza, and inside Israel. These carceral technologies, the separation wall, for example, the checkpoints, are the material constructs of what is increasingly referred to as Israeli apartheid. The story of the interrelationships between feminism and abolition has no appropriate end. With this conversation, we have just begun to explore a few of its dimensions. And so I hope you will continue this exploration and that we will find new ways of sharing ideas and producing communities of resistance that, to evoke the Borderlands theorist Gloria Anzaldúa, make borders productive so that they no longer divide, but unite us in new and ongoing quests for freedom. Thank you.
Working? Yes. Is it working? No. Okay. No? No? Thank you, Angela. This was really mind-boggling. So I think all of us, we are extremely impressed by how you were able to combine so many important concepts and also surprise us. I think this is a very important message that you gave, that we are, as academics, we are trained to fear the unexpected, and that it is really hard for us to be taken by surprise, because that's usually what we fear most, because it's a loss of control and then a loss of faith or honor or whatever. I mean, this I think is quite important. So what we will do now, we have a couple of questions for you, Nikita and I, and then we will open up to the audience so that you can also ask your questions. So let me start with actually something that you were including in your speech, namely that the personal is political. I think that's, of course, a sentence and a message that all of us here in this room know and have a certain history with. But I also think that maybe the understanding we have of this is very, very different. So my first question would actually be, what would be a new way to formulate this question? You know, what would it be? What personal is political? Because you also showed us that it really matters how we frame our questions. But what would be the challenge here to reformulate it?
Is this working? Yes. Well, that might be the beginning of a very long conversation. But in order to render it more succinct, I might say that we need to consider not only that the personal is political, but that the political is also personal. Early on, this slogan helped to mobilize, particularly in the anti-violence movement, the anti-rape movement in particular, because these were issues that heretofore had been rendered immune from public discourse, even from law enforcement. The battery, partner battery, spousal battery, was considered to be a domestic question and therefore not accessible to the police and other institutions. And so it was a very important rallying point. But at the same time, there were activists who pointed out that, that there was another side to that issue, that one can't simply consider it as a simplistic transformation of the personal into the political, but rather there were also institutional dimensions. Early on, many women of color activists recognized that if women suffered violence at the hands of their partners, at the hands of rapists, there was also violence that was emanating from institutions. And so how to think the violence emanating from the institutions together with the violence at the level of the individual. That is to say, how to imagine institutions as agents of violence, how to imagine the state as an agent of violence. And I'll end with one example, because otherwise I'll go on and on. But I'm involved in an organization in Australia that works around women prisoners' rights, but at the same time is an advocate of abolition. And I often point out that one of the most important campaigns initiated by that organization was a campaign against state sexual assault. This was the slogan of the campaign, against state sexual assault. And what were they referring to? They were referring to the very routine and accepted process of strip searching and cavity searching that happens as a matter of course in prisons, and especially in women's prisons all over the world. And so to reveal this routine practice as an instance of sexual assault required understanding that the state can also be a subject in ways that we had not recognized before. So it's a complicated question, but I think it's, and there's much more to say, but I will end here.
My second question would be what the idea that you or the statement that you've made about the abolition of the prisons, and I think it's a shortened version because there's a whole analysis behind this. Obviously, that the prison and incarceration leads to criminalization, and that there's a circle around this. But my question would be, because you're also an activist, and I think from gender studies point of view, where we are now with Judith Butler talking about the heterosexuality as a straitjacket, we could probably all agree with you about opening up the space. But what about when you are, as an activist, you are talking to women of all colors and backgrounds about this idea of the abolition of the prison? I was really wondering, what is the reaction to that?
Well, first let me say, I was arguing against simply opening up space. I was saying that is a project that would actually reproduce that against which we think we are resisting. But actually, it has taken some time to create a popular discourse on prison abolition. I would say, perhaps the last 2 decades. Interestingly, the notion of prison abolition has sort of accompanied the development of the prison. And what is interesting is that in the US, the Quakers introduced the idea of imprisonment as a more humane form of punishment. And this basically coincides with the American Revolution and all of the discussion about the new democracy and forms of punishment that were considered to be deeply undemocratic, corporal punishment, capital punishment. And so imprisonment emerges as the quintessential democratic form of punishment. And of course, it would take another lecture to explain that. But let me say that the very idea that the prison can rehabilitate, and although prisons have not rehabilitated, but this concept clings to the notion of imprisonment. That very idea was connected to the capitalist concept of giving time. As a matter of fact, if one wants to look at the Marx theory of the commodity, and also the notion of the value of time in relation to punishment, one sees very clearly some parallels. People have been most receptive to the concept of abolition when we very concretely show how prisons reproduce the very problems they purport to solve. And as a matter of fact, by drawing resources away from education, from healthcare, this process continually reproduces itself. There's a great deal of discussion in the US now about what is called, among educators, the school-to-prison pipeline. So that schools, particularly in poor communities of color, begin to look more like prisons than like places of learning. And the focus is on discipline and testing. Discipline and testing. So you see these parallels and the way in which the culture of the prison has invaded schools. And I think those arguments, the argument around the school-to-prison pipeline and the argument around the extent to which prisons absorb resources that would be better used in producing better modes of education and healthcare and recreation and so forth, have created the space for a serious discussion now on prison abolition. It's very interesting that even, and it's really bizarre to say this, that even conservatives are now saying that we need a strategy for decarceration, which is a major abolitionist strategy. Newt Gingrich, for example. And so sometimes we ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong? But at the same time, I like to think about the victories that we achieve in activist struggles as creating new arenas. And so rather than say that, oh, Newt Gingrich is just co-opting, what we have been doing, we should say, now it's time to move to another level. Because they recognize the extent to which the economy is suffering from this policy of mass incarceration. And we have to make arguments that aren't simply these simplistic economic arguments, arguments that are not about decreasing the reach of government, which is, of course, Newt Gingrich's point, because the prison system is the largest governmental program. And so we have to point out that abolition is about creating new institutions and creating a new society. It's about much, much more than simply getting rid of the prisons.
To follow up on the issue of the personal is political, you were placed in solitary confinement in the New York Women's House of Detention in the middle of Greenwich Village. Could you perhaps share with us your experiences during the incarceration?
Well, actually, I was in solitary confinement most of the time. I was in jail, and not only in New York, but also in California. And I understand the effort to separate me from other prisoners as political. It wasn't about me. As a matter of fact, initially when I was arrested in New York, I was placed in the section of the jail reserved for people with psychiatric problems and disorders. And the guards attempted to give me very strong psychotropic medication as they were distributing that medication to the other women there. So, that was about preventing. It wasn't so much an attack on me, it was an attack on all of the other women in the prison. But as in solitary, one of the things that, it may sound funny, but I'll say it anyway, but I realized that it wasn't nearly as hard as many people assume it to be, because students and intellectuals who are used to spending long periods of time, I had my books and I had a pen and paper. So I did, it, as a matter of fact, made me recall my time as a graduate student. But I don't want to be so humorous about it, because a man was just recently released from 40 years of solitary confinement in Angola prison, whose name is Herman Wallace. He was released on October 1st of this year, and he died on October 4th, having spent 4 decades in solitary confinement without losing his spirit. There's a wonderful art project that was done by an artist whom I met not long ago. I can't remember her name at the moment, but it is called The House That Herman Built. And you can find it online. She asked him to imagine what kind of house he would like to live in. And then she built that house for him.
I just asked the question also because in one of the interviews you mentioned that you could hear voices calling Angela, 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 while you were in the detention center in New York.
Oh, that's true. So,
you must have been quite scared, and I don't know, I'm just thinking, you were very young, you were in the prison, you must have been anxious for your own, and then you were hearing these voices outside calling Angela, Angela, Angela.
Well, actually, those voices were very comforting, because this was actually after I had been placed in the psychiatric facility. That was the first night I was in jail, after I was arrested. And by the way, I just recently found out how the FBI actually caught me, because a woman did a documentary on my trial, and she interviewed the FBI agent. But that's another story. But I was placed in this facility, and of course, yes, where am I? What am I going to do? And I had not been in touch with anyone. And then I heard these voices outside of the jail. This is when the jail was located in Greenwich Village. And I could just sort of barely hear people chanting, "Free Angela." And that, I think that made me recognize for the rest of the time I was in jail, that sense of community was key to survival. Because when I heard them, I no longer had the same fear. I didn't see myself as a single individual confronting the power of the state. I knew that there were, all of these people with me, and of course that multiplied to thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people all over the world.
Yeah, I think we could also go on, ask you questions about your biography and especially your Frankfurt time. So I'll ask that question and then I open up to the audience. We already, I think we heard today, of course, that the time you were here was somehow on the brink of the student movement starting to be active, 65 to 67. That was so when you left, that was the time when Benno Ohnesorg was killed in Berlin in the context of the demonstration against the Shah. So there were demonstrations. And also in your book, in your autobiography, you write about the hit and run demonstrations and campaigns you have been doing here in Frankfurt. So the question would be again, so when you look at your Frankfurt years, what stays with you?
Well, my sense was that there was already a student movement. And I think, unfortunately, we often think of the movement as only existing during its most dramatic moments. And we underestimate the organizing that happens. And I think that I was really privileged to be a part of that movement when the organizing was happening. And of course, as Stuart Hall points out, there are never any guarantees. So we did not know what was going to happen. But as a matter of fact, that organizing created an arena that allowed for the emergence of a very dramatic and widespread and powerful student movement. And I'll tell you that that among other things, we produced a pirate version of Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialektik der Aufklärung. We also produced a pirate version of Lukács's Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein. And I typed some of the pages. And if you can imagine what it was like in those days without the technologies of reproduction that we have today, of document reproduction, we had to basically cut stencils. But we did those books, the entire books, and that was a part of the political process. So I learned a great deal about the importance of intellectual work at the core of radical activism during my time here.
We'd like to invite questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones, one on the left side and one on the right side. Please come forward, and we'll take clusters of 3 questions.
Ms. Davis, as I stated to you before, as a child, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I was a child when they had the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. I would like to know if you as a child or a young woman growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, would you say that that motivated you to become an activist? and living in Birmingham and all of the unjust things that were going on there, especially with the dogs, Bull Connor, and all of that? Was that your motivation?
Second question here, Hans-Jürgen.
Thank you. Hans-Jürgen Puhle. I have a simple and pedestrian question. I'm wondering what you might think we are gaining by stretching the concept of feminism towards what comes close to die neue Totalität, meaning a comprehensive concept of economic, social, and cultural revolution. I have no problem with it, I am for it, but why call it feminism? You could have said alternatively, feminism alone, as we know it, isn't enough.
And the third question there. Could you raise your hand, please? The mic will be brought to you. Yep. Oh.
Hello. Very honored to ask this question. First of all, I want to point out that I'm not talking to my professors here who are giving me the chance to always say what I want to say and write what I want to write. But what do you say when the personal is political, then the institutional is political as well? And when you find yourself bordered in institutions like this university that have names such as Adorno and Marcuse and Davis on their flags, but then the flag waves to another wind, and the vice president disappears after 5 minutes after he was so eager to hear you speak.
Okay, great questions. And how many questions are we going to attempt to take? So I know how long. Okay. The first question, what motivated me to become an activist? Certainly growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, played an important role in my development as an activist. As a matter of fact, I can't even remember when I wasn't an activist. People have asked me many times, what was the moment when you knew that you wanted to be? And so I keep thinking in terms of moments, so yes, I thought about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and that whole period, which was exactly 50 years ago, and I'll talk a little bit about that on Saturday. Is that when I'm speaking again? Yes, the next lecture on Saturday. And then I've said, actually, when I was 11 years old, I was a member of a youth discussion group that was integrated, that had black and white youth. And the church where we were holding our discussions was bombed. This was, of course, before the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, and as you know, there were numerous bombings, and I'll talk about that terrorism that is at the heart of the history of the U.S. Tomorrow. And then I recently recall that when I was very, very young, maybe about 4 or 5, we had a game that we played all the time. And that game involved running from the side of the street where we lived, where my parents had recently bought a house, to the other side of the street, which was zoned only for white people. We lived on the border of the black zone. And as children, we developed this game where we would dare each other to run across the street, knowing full well that it was totally illegal, that we could actually be arrested for being on the other side of the street. And those who were really bold not only ran across the street, but ran up the steps of some white person's house and rang the doorbell and tried to run back to safety before the white person answered. So I think that was when I became an activist. Okay, the second question, what are we gaining by stretching the concept of feminism? Now, I'm not suggesting that this process of rendering feminism more capacious is valid by itself, on its own. I'm simply looking at a kind of genealogy of feminism that takes into account work that was initially poised against feminism, that eventually came to form and formulate a very different kind of feminism. And it's true, we could, what were the examples you gave? Well, Marxism, and I think that Marxism still has a great deal to offer those of us who persist in believing that it is possible to contest capitalism as a permanent arrangement. I think feminism adds a really important dimension, and the kind of feminism into which I identify. And let me say, I'm not just talking about feminism. I should have been clear. Maybe I wasn't clear. I'm not just talking about feminism. I'm talking about a particular version of feminism, because there are multiple feminisms. I certainly don't identify with the feminism of those who assume that the main task of feminism is to bring more women into the corporate apparatus and into governmental apparatuses. So I'm using this to define a particular kind of revolutionary approach. So as you see, I was stretching myself because I said feminism, then I said anti-racist feminism, then I said Marxist-inflected anti-racist feminism. So I think what feminism has offered us is an ability to bring issues and objects and processes together that previously were considered to be entirely separate, and on the other hand, to disaggregate that which was considered complete and whole. All right, the last question. Oh yes, that was the question about the personal is political and the institutional is political. Yeah, where are you? Where are you? Okay. Those of us who choose to inhabit spaces like this have to be willing to inhabit contradictions. And we have to resist the temptation to reconcile the contradiction. We have to resist the temptation to choose one pole or the other in order to allow that contradiction to become productive. What does it seem like I'm talking about now? But yes, and I think what's most important is to constantly remind ourselves of the contradictory character of our predicament without assuming that it can be resolved. And as someone who has spent the majority of my life in institutional settings like this, I can tell you that there was not one institution with which I've been affiliated, that I would not also be willing to subject to critique. And I'll tell you a secret. It's very interesting that I'm spending these 2 weeks in Frankfurt, and in the spring I'm going to teach at UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, which was my very first job, from which I was fired by Ronald Reagan. And of course, aside from the fact that there will probably be people who will be upset that I'm teaching at UCLA again, I also have to resist the temptation to say, oh yes, now UCLA is doing really well. They've invited me to teach again. The same problems of structural racism exist. As a matter of fact, they may be even greater in the University of California, where we now have, I should say, the former Janet Neapolitano, does her name sound familiar? Homeland Security. The former head of Homeland Security is now president of the entire University of California system. So what more can I say?
Yeah, we are taking 3 more questions and then we'll finish. Yeah, here. Can you come with the mic? It's on this side next to the camera. Okay. Yes.
My name is Christa Buschendorf, and I'd like to come back to your ideas about the prison. You indicated yourself that the function of prisons today are no longer the ones that we were used to, like from retribution to resocialization to locking up dangerous people. Some critics today think that this is more about the surplus bodies in neoliberal capitalism. Now, if that is the case, and we could make arguments for that, that the mass of people locked up are people that are no longer needed in the market, then does it not become more difficult to think of abolition? Because if that's the main interest, and I don't know whether you would agree to that, I'm referring to Loïc Vacan's thesis, then how do we achieve abolitionism? Is it not getting more difficult then?
Thank you. Second question.
Yes. Professor Davis, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to ask a question that has to do about anti-racism and diversity work. I'm originally from the US, and in my work here on anti-racism and diversity, one was always able to use the United States as an example, but since the inauguration of Barack Obama, we've seen a backlash, we've seen a reemergence of Jim Crow strategies, we've seen voter suppression, and I just wanted to ask you what you think, or in which direction is the United States possibly going?
That's a question. I think we'll be here another 4 hours to answer that. Okay, there was one more question.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. I've come from Vienna just to see you. I can't believe I'm talking to you right now, actually. I have a question concerning specifically black women, as you also mentioned earlier, as such a driving force in black movements, be it in the US, be it also in Germany. I really very much appreciate that you also mentioned Farbe bekennen, because also being in Austria, it's a very strong tie for us as black women. And at the same time, there's this strong criminalization of black women in activism, also globally. And then when we think of Assata Shakur, who recently made the top 10 wanted list, so for me, the question is, what does that mean for us? And also in your movement now, in your development, in the way you are traveling the world, lecturing, and at the same time, having been criminalized yourself. Of course, beyond that, for the movement globally for black women, what does that mean?
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much. All of the three questions. The question about abolition. Actually, I think that the argument regarding the production of surplus bodies under the reign of global capitalism is an even more powerful argument for abolition. And it should be pointed out that abolition does not simply refer to the negative process of getting rid of prisons. There is the process of creating new institutions that actually respond to the needs that are purportedly addressed by the prison. And so abolition is not just about getting rid of these facilities of confinement, but it's about envisioning and creating new kinds of education. It's about healthcare. It's about all of the kinds of institutions and processes that human beings need to realize whatever potential there might be. And I should point out that this theory of prison abolition rests a great deal on the unfinished project of anti-slavery abolition. The argument is that we need a 21st century abolitionism because, at least in the US, the 19th century abolition process never achieved its goals. And as a matter of fact, when one looks at the development of the prison in the US, and there's a wonderful book by a scholar activist whose name is Robert Perkins, it's called Texas Tough. And so he looks at the way in which slavery and the aftermath of slavery actually helped to shape the punishment system in the U.S. If you look at the criminologists who try to understand the history of the prison system in the U.S., they're focusing on the systems in the Northeast. They're focusing on Philadelphia, and they're focusing on Auburn, New York, what was called the silent system and the congregate system, both of which were designed to rehabilitate. But on the other hand, you had the convict lease systems, plantations. Angola prison, for example, to which I referred a moment ago, was originally a plantation under slavery. And then it came to be used as a site for the leasing of convicts. And it remains today a system that functions very much the same way it functioned in the aftermath of slavery. So we're looking at the extent to which the prison system recapitulates modes of slavery. And therefore, the abolitionist project is one that attempts to accomplish what should have been accomplished in the 19th century, namely the creation of the kinds of institutions that would have allowed former slaves to be incorporated in, which would also have meant radically transforming the very nature of democracy. And this conversation could go on forever. But, okay. The second question, anti-racism and diversity work. Well, you know, it's true that we tend to look to the U.S., that people tend to look to the U.S. And I'm not sure whether that's a really good thing. It is true that we can claim a kind of unbroken history of struggle against racism since the era of slavery. But it's also true that there are racisms in Europe that oftentimes are not recognized because racism is always somewhere else. It's always elsewhere. And it seems to me that the best kind of effort to understand what is going on, say, in the US, would be an effort that also creates space for the emergence of insights about modes of racism that are so clearly connected to the process of colonization and the post-colonial era. Now, diversity. I should say a few words about diversity, because I know diversity is in the title of the professorship. And I also have to admit that I have been a part of many efforts to challenge the use of the concept diversity, largely because it has become a corporate concept, largely because it has come to mean placing people of color in visible positions, not necessarily powerful, although also sometimes powerful, under the assumption that the machine will work exactly as it worked before. So my critique has been that diversity can be used. I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be used, and I'm hoping that it will have a more capacious meaning that will definitely involve social justice here in terms of the chair. But one of the points that I have made repeatedly is that the corporate diversity and oftentimes diversity on university campuses refers to difference that doesn't make a difference. Difference that makes no difference at all. And I think we have to beware of that tendency simply to focus on visible bodies. Okay, and the last question, thank you so much about asking the question about Assata Shakur. I had actually opened my talk by evoking Assata, and then I realized I would be talking for 2 hours, so I had to cut out a great deal of what I prepared. But Assata Shakur is very close to my heart, and I think that she emblemizes the issue you raised, both Black women as a driving force in radical movements, but also Black women as a target, the kind of pathologization and criminalization. I mean, Black women are subject to forms of criminalization that are often more complicated than the racial profiling and stop and frisk. And Assata Shakur, if you're not aware of her history, she wrote a wonderful biography. It's called Assata. She was active in a number of movements, including the Black Panther Party during the early days. She went to prison, and that case is so incredibly fraudulent. And, maybe at another time we talk about why. But eventually she actually escaped from prison and traveled to Cuba, where she was given political asylum. She arrived in Cuba in 1984, and she has been living there since then. I think Assata is now 60, she's younger than I am, so she would be maybe 66, 67, something like that. And some years ago, the FBI decided to create a $1 million reward. This was in the context of the emergence of privatized, the private military, Blackwater, and all of these corporations of mercenaries. And then, just last May, this past May, she was placed on the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted terrorists in the world. And they added another $1 million to the reward. So there's now a $2 million reward on her head. And how can she be so dangerous? I mean, what is a terrorist? As a matter of fact, I had a quote from Assata in my talk, which refers to the time she spent in prison, and all she saw was black flesh behind bars. And she writes about the violence of imprisonment, and finally she says, "And we are the terrorists, and we are the terrorists." When I think about Assata being labeled as a terrorist, and I'll probably talk about this on Saturday, I remember the extent to which our communities, our neighborhoods, when I was growing up as a child, were subject to terrorism of an overt sort. As a matter of fact, many people know that the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed on September 15, 1963. But what is not necessarily known is that houses were bombed and other churches were bombed. And this had been going on since the 1940s. And as a matter of fact, we knew who was doing it. Because the man, his name was Robert Chambliss, his nickname was Dynamite Bob. And so when I was growing up, my first memories are actually the sound of bombs, houses being bombed across the street from the house where I lived. This is terrorism. And that form of terrorism gets completely erased in the US popular discourse on terrorism. Whether it is grounded in anti-Muslim racism, or whether it consists in an effort to target a woman by the name of Assata Shakur, and through her, a younger generation of activists. I'll conclude by saying that when I first learned about her placement on the 10 most wanted terrorist lists, my immediate response was, it's not about Assata. Because I had come to understand, when I personally experienced being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted criminal lists, that at first I said, why did they put me on, why am I one of the 10 most wanted criminals in the country? And why am I characterized as armed and dangerous when, I have nothing but my books? And so then I realized it wasn't about me. It was actually the logic of terrorism, using the logic of terrorism. That is to say, through Asata, terrorizing young activists who would, otherwise stand up in the way she did to the, racist and imperialist authorities. And so thank you so much for asking that question. I think we should be aware of the extent to which institutions have very long memories. Institutional memories are much longer than individual memories. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That was absolutely inspiring. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a few people without whose support this event would not have been possible. So may I kindly request the student assistants at the CGC and FRCPS to come forward. I won't take the names. Stefan, why don't you come? I said I won't take the names, but Stefan, Jonathan, Maria Teresa, Lisa, Susanna, Joanna. Yeah, Maria Teresa. Please don't make me take the names. Please come in the front. All of y'all, FRCPS and CGC. You all have done the hard work. Now don't be shy to get the credit. Please, please come in the front. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank the technical support, the camera people, the sound people there at the back. Please join me in thanking all of them. Without their support, this event would not have been possible. Everybody is kindly not requested, but invited to join us at the FRCPS Angela Davis party with the theme, If I Can't Dance, It's Not My Revolution. DJ Sushila Mashkita is here from Vienna. So we're going to have some really groovy music. But before we invite you all to shake a leg with us, there's a reception, so we have some drinks and some food as reinforcement. So please join us in the foyer for the food and the drinks. And I'd kindly request everybody to vacate this room so that we can clear the chairs and prepare the dance floor. Thank you very much, and once again, thanks. Thank you once again to Angela Davis for the wonderfully inspiring evening. Thank you.